The gentle hum of summer bees mingled with the cheerful chatter of villagers across the manicured lawns of Thornfield Manor, creating a symphony of contentment that had echoed through countless English afternoons. The annual summer fete was in full, glorious swing, a tradition as enduring as the ancient oak that presided over the croquet pitch and as comforting as the weathered Cotswold stone of the manor house itself. Children, their faces sticky from iced buns and their hands stained purple from blackberry tarts, chased each other through beds of fragrant roses, their laughter echoing against the elegant Georgian facade. Elderly ladies, resplendent in their finest floral frocks and wide-brimmed hats adorned with silk flowers, sipped lukewarm tea from delicate china cups and exchanged the sort of polite gossip that formed the backbone of village society. Miss Jane Marple, perched comfortably on a wicker chair beneath the dappled shade of an ancient chestnut tree, observed the scene with her characteristic quiet intensity. Her knitting, a sensible grey shawl intended for a distant nephew, lay momentarily forgotten in her lap as her keen blue eyes, though appearing mild and unfocused to the casual observer, missed absolutely nothing of the human drama unfolding before her. She had been invited by Lady Pemberton, the manor's gracious mistress, who had inherited both the estate and its accompanying social obligations following her husband's untimely death from a heart attack 2 years prior. To Miss Marple, humanity was an intricate tapestry woven with entirely predictable threads, and the patterns of village life were as familiar to her as the complex stitches in her own needlework. Lady Eleanor Pemberton moved through her guests with the practiced grace that came from a lifetime of social responsibility, her silver hair coiled meticulously at the nape of her neck and her pearls, a cherished family heirloom, catching the afternoon sunlight with every graceful turn of her head. Though she maintained her role as the perfect hostess with impeccable charm, Miss Marple's discerning eye detected a certain weariness etched around the widow's eyes, a subtle tension that spoke of burdens carried in private. The manor itself, with its sprawling gardens and labyrinthine corridors filled with generations of accumulated treasures, stood as a silent testament to Pemberton prosperity and perhaps, Miss Marple mused, to secrets known only to its most trusted inhabitants. Chief among those long-standing residents was Mrs. Agnes Whitmore, the manor's head housekeeper for over 30 years, a woman whose presence had become so thoroughly integrated into the fabric of Thornfield that guests scarcely noticed her efficient movements. Agnes was renowned throughout the village for her impeccable standards, her unwavering loyalty to the Pemberton family, and most notably, her uncanny ability to observe everything that transpired within the manor's walls without ever appearing to do so deliberately. The local gossips often whispered with a mixture of admiration and unease that nothing escaped Mrs. Whitmore's attention, a quality that had made her both invaluable to her employers and occasionally uncomfortable for those who preferred their private affairs to remain hidden. Earlier that afternoon, while helping arrange the elaborate tea service on the terrace, Miss Marple had noticed something distinctly unusual in Mrs. Whitmore's typically composed demeanor. The housekeeper, normally as steady and predictable as the grandfather clock in the main hall, had seemed uncharacteristically flustered, her usually placid features marred by an almost imperceptible tremor around her mouth. She had dropped a silver sugar tong, an unprecedented display of clumsiness for someone whose movements were ordinarily precise as clockwork, and had quickly retreated toward the manor's interior, citing a need to fetch additional teacups despite the tray already overflowing with the finest spode china. The fete continued its gentle, civilized progression as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the perfectly manicured lawn. Mrs. Bantry's cake stall was conducting a thriving trade, while children shrieked with unbridled delight at the coconut shy, and Colonel Melchett, slightly worse for wear from sampling the local cider, attempted with questionable success to demonstrate his prowess at the ring toss. Mr. Arthur Penhaligon, the village solicitor whose expanding waistcoat testified to his appreciation of good food, held court near the lemonade stand, dispensing legal advice and local gossip with equal enthusiasm, his booming laughter carrying across the grounds like a familiar, comforting refrain. As the golden afternoon light began to fade and preparations commenced for the evening's entertainment, a small crowd gathered near the makeshift stage where the annual talent competition was scheduled to begin. Young Penelope Davies, known throughout the village for her surprisingly powerful soprano voice, was visible near the platform, her nervous fidgeting apparent even from a distance. Lady Pemberton was expected to deliver the traditional opening remarks, a role she had always relished, often providing witty, if occasionally pointed, observations about village life and its colorful inhabitants. Suddenly, a piercing shriek tore through the peaceful air, sharp and utterly incongruous with the pastoral tranquility that had prevailed moments before. The sound made every head snap up in alarm, every conversation cease mid-sentence, and every heart clench with an inexplicable sense of dread. The shriek emanated from the rear of the manor house, near the servants' entrance, an area usually bustling with quiet, efficient activity, but now ominously silent. A young scullery maid burst from around the corner of the house, her face ashen with terror and her apron stained a vivid, horrifying crimson. "Mrs. Whitmore!" she wailed, her voice carrying with chilling clarity across the suddenly hushed assembly. "Oh, dear God, Mrs. Whitmore is dead!" The words hung in the air like a death knell, transforming the perfect English afternoon into something far more sinister. Miss Marple, though maintaining her outwardly calm composure, felt the familiar stirring of recognition. The housekeeper, who had seen too much, had finally seen something that had cost her everything. The piercing shriek that had shattered the afternoon's tranquility left behind a peculiar, breathless silence, the sort that follows a thunderclap and makes one question whether the sound was real or imagined. Lady Pemberton, her face draining of color but her aristocratic composure holding firm, stepped forward with the natural authority that generations of noblesse oblige had bred into her very bones. Her voice, though slightly tremulous, cut through the rising murmur of shocked voices as she directed Colonel Melcher to telephone immediately for both Dr. Haydock and the constabulary, while firmly requesting that all guests remain on the front lawn until the authorities could assess the situation. The transformation from genteel garden party to crime scene was as swift as it was surreal. The cheerful bunting and abandoned teacups now seeming grotesquely inappropriate against the backdrop of sudden death. Miss Marple rose from her wicker chair with deceptive casualness, her knitting abandoned, but her keen eyes already cataloguing every reaction, every gesture, every telling detail that might later prove significant. She had learned long ago that moments of crisis stripped away the careful veneer of social propriety, revealing the true nature of individuals when they believed themselves unobserved. The art of detection, she reflected, lay not in dramatic confrontations or brilliant deductions, but in the patient observation of human nature at its most vulnerable and unguarded moments. Young Elsie, the scullery maid whose blood-stained apron had announced the tragedy, stood trembling near the servants' entrance, her face ashen and her hands shaking as she attempted to answer Lady Pemberton's gentle but urgent questions. Between gasping sobs and fragmented words, she managed to convey that she had discovered Mrs. Whitmore in the small pantry adjacent to the kitchen, where the housekeeper had apparently gone to fetch additional supplies for the afternoon's festivities. The poor girl's account, though broken by shock and tears, painted a grim picture of the trusted housekeeper lying motionless among scattered preserve jars, the heavy brass candlestick that normally graced the morning-room mantelpiece now stained with what could only be blood. The village's response to the tragedy was a fascinating study in human psychology, each person's immediate reaction revealing far more about their own character and concerns than about the circumstances themselves. Mrs. Bantry, never one to resist the opportunity for dramatic speculation, immediately began theorizing about potential motives, her voice carrying clearly across the lawn as she enumerated various individuals who might have harbored grudges against the seemingly irreproachable housekeeper. According to her fertile imagination, Mrs. Whitmore's position had afforded her access to countless family secrets, making her potentially dangerous to anyone with something significant to hide. The theory, while melodramatic, contained enough plausible truth to make several guests exchange uncomfortable glances. Colonel Melchett, having completed his telephone duties with military efficiency, returned to announce that both Dr. Haydock and Constable Reeves would arrive shortly, along with Inspector Slack from the County Constabulary, if the situation warranted such attention. The Colonel's authoritative presence provided some measure of comfort to the more nervous guests, though Miss Marple noticed that several individuals seemed particularly anxious about the prospect of official questioning, their fidgeting and whispered conversations suggesting concerns that extended beyond mere shock at the tragic discovery. Mr. Arthur Penhaligon, the village solicitor whose expanding waistcoat testified to his appreciation of good living, had positioned himself strategically near the manor's front entrance, where he could observe both the comings and goings of official personnel and the reactions of his fellow guests. His legal training had taught him the value of careful observation during times of crisis, and his sharp eyes were busy cataloguing every significant detail for future reference. Miss Marple found his behavior particularly interesting, noting that while his outward manner remained professionally composed, his hands betrayed a subtle tremor that suggested deeper emotional involvement than mere professional curiosity would warrant. Of particular interest was the behavior of Mr. Julian Pemberton, Lady Pemberton's nephew, who had returned only 3 weeks prior from what the village gossips described as either a triumphant sojourn or an ignominious exile in Monte Carlo, depending upon which version of events one chose to believe. He stood now at the edge of the croquet pitch, carefully lighting a cigarette with hands that appeared steady, but which Miss Marple's experienced eye detected held just the slightest tremor. His profile was elegant, his expression carefully arranged in what might pass for shocked concern, but there was something in his manner that suggested a man calculating his next move rather than simply reacting to unexpected tragedy. Dr. Haydock arrived within minutes, his black medical bag clutched firmly in his weathered hands, and his usually jovial expression replaced by professional gravity. He disappeared into the manor's interior with Lady Pemberton, leaving the assembled guests to continue their increasingly wild speculations. When he emerged 20 minutes later, his grave expression and the hushed, urgent conversation he held with Lady Pemberton confirmed everyone's worst fears. The preliminary examination, gleaned from fragments of overheard conversation, indicated that Mrs. Whitmore had indeed met with foul play, the brass candlestick having been employed as a weapon with sufficient force to ensure that the housekeeper's extensive knowledge of Thornfield Manor's secrets had died with her. The arrival of Constable Reeves, followed shortly by the more imposing figure of Inspector Slack, marked the formal beginning of what promised to be a thorough and potentially embarrassing investigation. Inspector Slack, a competent if somewhat pedestrian officer whose previous experience with village crime had been limited primarily to petty theft and domestic disputes, surveyed the assembled crowd with methodical attention that suggested he was already forming preliminary theories about potential suspects and motives. The inspector's presence transformed the tragic situation into something official and frightening, the realization dawning on everyone present that one among them was very likely a murderer. Miss Marple, maintaining her position on the periphery of the crowd, continued her own quiet observations, her experienced eye noting the subtle ways in which guilt and innocence manifested themselves in human behavior. Young Penelope Davies, who had been preparing for her performance in the talent competition, stood apart from the main group, her face pale with shock and her earlier nervousness now transformed into something approaching genuine fear. The girl's distress seemed disproportionate to what one might expect from a casual acquaintance with the deceased, suggesting perhaps a more personal connection to Mrs. Whitmore than was immediately apparent. As the golden afternoon light began to fade and the police began their preliminary interviews, the peaceful English village atmosphere had been irrevocably shattered. The afternoon's tragedy had stripped away the polite veneer of village society, revealing the complex web of relationships, resentments, and secrets that lay beneath the surface of their seemingly harmonious community. Mrs. Whitmore, Miss Marple reflected sadly, had indeed seen too much, and someone among them had decided that her silence was worth killing for. The housekeeper, who had spent 30 years observing the intimate details of village life, had finally observed something that had cost her everything, and now it fell to those she left behind to uncover which of her many secrets had proven deadly. Inspector Slack's methodical approach to the investigation revealed both his professional competence and his fundamental limitations as a detective, his tendency toward obvious conclusions creating an atmosphere of barely concealed frustration among the more perceptive observers. Miss Marple, positioned strategically near the rose garden where she could observe without appearing intrusive, found herself quietly cataloguing the inspector's missed opportunities with the same careful attention she might apply to identifying dropped stitches in a complex knitting pattern. The transformation from genteel garden party to crime scene was swift and jarring, the cheerful bunting and abandoned teacups now seeming grotesquely inappropriate against the backdrop of sudden death. The preliminary interviews, conducted with all the subtlety of a brass band, quickly established the basic facts that everyone already suspected. Mrs. Whitmore had been struck down by the heavy brass candlestick from the morning room, the weapon having been wielded with sufficient force to ensure that the housekeeper's extensive knowledge of household affairs had died with her. Dr. Haydock's examination suggested the attack had occurred sometime between 3 and 4 o'clock, precisely when the garden party was at its most festive, and when the servants' quarters would have been relatively deserted as most of the staff had been pressed into service for the outdoor festivities. What emerged from Inspector Slack's questioning was a fascinating portrait of the deceased woman that went far beyond her official role as head housekeeper. Mrs. Whitmore, it appeared, had been the sort of person who noticed everything and forgot nothing, a quality that had made her invaluable to the Pemberton family, but potentially troublesome to anyone with secrets to conceal. Young Elsie, still trembling from her horrific discovery, revealed between tearful sobs that Mrs. Whitmore had been acting strangely for the past several days, jumping at unexpected sounds and appearing unusually preoccupied with matters that normally would not have troubled her steady nerves. More significantly, Elsie had overheard the housekeeper making a mysterious telephone call the previous evening, speaking in hushed, urgent tones about something that needed to be set right before it was too late for everyone concerned. Miss Marple's attention was particularly drawn to the reactions of various guests as these details emerged. Mr. Julian Pemberton, Lady Pemberton's nephew whose recent return from the continent had been the subject of considerable village speculation, displayed a carefully controlled composure that suggested either remarkable self-possession or considerable practice at concealing his true feelings. His responses to the inspector's questions were precise and helpful, perhaps too much so, as if he had rehearsed his answers in advance. When asked about his whereabouts during the critical period, he claimed to have been engaged in conversation with several guests near the croquet pitch, though Miss Marple noted that his alleged companions seemed somewhat uncertain about the exact timing of their interactions. While Inspector Slack focused on establishing alibis and examining the crime scene, Miss Marple found herself drawn to more subtle details that spoke volumes about human nature and hidden relationships. During a brief visit to the kitchen, ostensibly to comfort poor Elsie, she noticed several intriguing elements that the official investigation had overlooked. The servants' corridor held the faint but unmistakable scent of violet perfume, an old-fashioned fragrance that seemed out of place among the usual aromas of soap, starch, and hot pastry. Violet was a particular choice, favored by those who wished to appear traditional while maintaining their own quiet preferences, and Miss Marple filed this observation away with the same care she reserved for particularly useful knitting patterns. Equally fascinating was the behavior of Mrs. Bantry, whose initial enthusiasm for dramatic speculation had given way to an uncharacteristic reticence when the inspector's questions turned to her own movements during the afternoon. The usually voluble woman seemed suddenly reluctant to discuss her temporary absence from the main festivities, claiming only that she had needed to powder her nose and had briefly visited the manor's interior for that purpose. Her explanation, while perfectly reasonable, was delivered with a nervous flutter that suggested there might be more to the story than she was willing to reveal in such public circumstances. Mr. Arthur Penhaligon, the village solicitor whose professional training had taught him the value of careful observation, proved to be a more reliable witness regarding the general movements of the guests throughout the afternoon. His account provided a useful framework for understanding who had been where and when, though Miss Marple noticed that even his methodical recollection contained certain gaps that might prove significant. Of particular interest was his mention of having noticed Mrs. Whitmore in earnest conversation with someone near the servants' entrance approximately half an hour before her body was discovered, though the distance and angle had prevented him from identifying her companion. Young Penelope Davies, whose planned performance in the talent competition had been overshadowed by the tragedy, seemed particularly affected by the news of Mrs. Whitmore's death. Her distress appeared to go beyond what one might expect from a casual acquaintance, and when Inspector Slack questioned her about her relationship with the deceased, she became visibly flustered. Her explanation that Mrs. Whitmore had been kind to her during difficult family circumstances seemed genuine enough, but Miss Marple detected an undercurrent of anxiety that suggested the girl might be concealing something significant about their connection. The way Penelope's eyes sought out Julian Pemberton during questioning, and his subtle avoidance of her gaze, created a pattern of behavior that spoke of secrets shared and complications unspoken. The inspector's attention was inevitably drawn to the question of motive, and here the investigation began to reveal the complex web of relationships and potential grievances that existed beneath the surface of village harmony. Mrs. Whitmore's position had afforded her intimate knowledge of the Pemberton family's affairs, including financial matters that might prove embarrassing if made public. Moreover, her long service had made her privy to countless personal secrets, romantic entanglements, and family disputes that various individuals might prefer to keep hidden from public scrutiny. The mysterious phone call that Elsie had overheard suggested that Mrs. Whitmore had been planning to reveal something significant, perhaps something that someone was desperate to keep hidden. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and Inspector Slack continued his methodical but somewhat plodding investigation, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that the solution to Mrs. Whitmore's murder lay not in the obvious motives of greed or revenge, but in the more subtle realm of secrets and relationships that defined village life. The housekeeper had indeed seen too much, but the question remained. What specific knowledge had proven so dangerous that someone had been willing to commit murder to ensure her silence? The answer, Miss Marple suspected, lay hidden in the complex patterns of human behavior that she had spent a lifetime learning to read. Patterns that were as predictable as they were tragic in their inevitable consequences. The quiet investigation had begun in earnest, not with dramatic accusations or brilliant deductions, but with the patient observation of humanity at its most vulnerable and revealing moments. Inspector Slack's methodical approach to the investigation had reached that satisfying stage where circumstantial evidence began to coalesce around a single, seemingly obvious suspect, much to the relief of those who preferred their village scandals resolved swiftly and with minimal disruption to the established social order. The inspector's keen eye for practical motives and straightforward solutions had inevitably settled upon Julian Pemberton, Lady Pemberton's nephew, whose recent return from Monte Carlo under diplomatically vague circumstances had already made him the subject of considerable local speculation. Julian's financial difficulties, his intimate knowledge of Thornfield Manor's layout, and most significantly, his apparent familiarity with Mrs. Whitmore's habits and routines, created a compelling narrative that satisfied Inspector Slack's preference for tangible evidence over psychological complexity. The case against Julian strengthened with each piece of testimony that emerged from the inspector's painstaking questioning of household staff and guests. Young Elsie, still trembling from her horrific discovery, reluctantly revealed that she had overheard a heated argument between Julian and Mrs. Whitmore just 3 days prior, an exchange that had centered on what she described as money matters, and had concluded with Mrs. Whitmore's stern declaration that such behavior would not be tolerated in a respectable household. The housekeeper's well-known moral, rectitude and fierce loyalty to Lady Pemberton would have made Julian's apparent attempts to exploit his aunt's generosity absolutely intolerable, providing a clear motive for desperate action when faced with exposure of his financial machinations. More damaging still was Julian's frustratingly vague alibi for the crucial period between 3 and 4 o'clock, when Mrs. Whitmore had met her violent end. While he claimed to have been engaged in casual conversation near the croquet pitch, the individuals he named as witnesses seemed uncertain about the exact timing and duration of their interactions. Mr. Penhaligon, whose legal training had made him particularly attentive to such details, could confirm only that he had seen Julian at various points throughout the afternoon, but could provide no precise timeline that would definitively establish his innocence. This uncertainty, combined with Julian's obvious nervousness during questioning and his somewhat evasive answers about his recent continental activities, created an atmosphere of growing suspicion that even his considerable natural charm could not entirely dispel. The village's reaction to these developments revealed the complex social dynamics that governed their seemingly harmonious community. Mrs. Bantry, never one to resist the opportunity for dramatic speculation, immediately declared that she had always suspected something unsavory about that young man, conveniently forgetting her earlier, effusive praise for his continental sophistication. Others, particularly those who harbored quiet resentments about inherited privilege and unearned advantages, found grim satisfaction in witnessing the downfall of someone they perceived as having squandered opportunities that others could only dream of possessing. The brass candlestick, taken from the morning room where Julian would have had easy access during his frequent visits, provided both means and opportunity in Inspector Slack's increasingly confident assessment of the case. Yet Miss Marple found herself growing increasingly troubled by the very convenience of the emerging solution, her decades of patient observation having taught her to be deeply suspicious of mysteries that resolved themselves too neatly or obviously. While she watched Inspector Slack's methodical progress toward what seemed an inevitable arrest, her own quiet investigation had begun to reveal subtle inconsistencies and overlooked details that suggested a far more complex truth than the inspector's straightforward narrative would accommodate. The elderly detective's long experience with human nature had taught her that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared least capable of violence, while the most obvious suspects frequently proved to be elaborate misdirections designed to protect the truly guilty party. Her growing skepticism was reinforced by several small but significant observations that seemed to contradict the official theory. The faint but unmistakable scent of violet perfume that she had detected in the servants' corridor was decidedly not a fragrance that Julian Pemberton would have worn, nor was it consistent with any of the masculine cologne she associated with the other male guests at the afternoon's festivities. Violet was a distinctly feminine choice, old-fashioned and particular, suggesting an entirely different presence in the area where Mrs. Whitmore had met her death. Moreover, her careful observation of Julian's behavior throughout the crisis had revealed a young man who appeared genuinely shocked by the housekeeper's murder, his nervousness seeming to stem more from awareness of how his circumstances might appear to investigators, rather than from any consciousness of actual guilt. More intriguingly, Miss Marple had begun to notice patterns of behavior among the other guests that suggested the investigation was focusing its attention in entirely the wrong direction. Young Penelope Davies continued to display a level of distress that seemed disproportionate to her claimed casual acquaintance with the deceased, while her frequent, anxious glances toward Julian suggested a personal connection that neither had acknowledged during the official questioning. Mrs. Bantry's uncharacteristic reticence about her own movements during the critical period remained curiously unexplained, and her obvious relief at the inspector's focus on Julian struck the observant Miss Marple as suspiciously convenient for someone who usually thrived on being the center of dramatic attention. Most significantly, the mysterious telephone call that Elsie had overheard the previous evening continued to puzzle Miss Marple's methodical mind. Mrs. Whitmore's urgent words about something that needed to be set right before it became too late for everyone concerned suggested a woman attempting to prevent disaster rather than threatening to create it. This painted a picture of the housekeeper as someone trying to protect rather than expose, a distinction that fundamentally altered the potential motives for her murder. As Inspector Slack prepared to formalize his suspicions with an official arrest, Miss Marple remained convinced that the real killer continued to hide among them, protected by assumptions and misdirection that had fooled even the competent inspector and threatened to destroy an innocent, if flawed, young man. The gathering dusk cast long shadows across Thornfield Manor's grounds, lending an air of melancholy that seemed to echo the day's tragic events, while Inspector Slack prepared to conclude his investigation with the satisfying efficiency of a man who believed in straightforward solutions to complex problems. His confidence in Julian Pemberton's guilt had solidified throughout the afternoon's questioning, the circumstantial evidence forming what he considered an unassailable case that would see the young man arrested by morning. The inspector's methodical approach had uncovered motive, opportunity, and means in a neat package that appealed to his preference for tangible facts over psychological speculation, though Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the very convenience of such a tidy resolution to what her instincts suggested was a far more complex mystery. Under the pretext of offering comfort to the distraught household staff, Miss Marple had managed to conduct her own discreet examination of the crime scene, her gentle manner and apparent harmlessness allowing her to move through the manor's corridors without arousing official suspicion. The pantry where Mrs. Whitmore had met her violent end retained the chalk outline that marked the housekeeper's final position, a stark reminder of mortality that contrasted sharply with the orderly rows of preserved jars and household supplies that had been her domain for 30 years. While Inspector Slack had focused on the obvious evidence, Miss Marple's trained eye sought the subtle details that often proved more revealing than dramatic discoveries, her decades of patient observation having taught her that truth frequently hid in the most unlikely places. It was during this careful examination that Miss Marple made a discovery that would fundamentally alter her understanding of the crime's true nature. Nestled almost imperceptibly within the dried blood stain on Mrs. Whitmore's sensible gray apron, she detected a single, delicate speck of bright yellow pollen, so minuscule that it had escaped the notice of both the forensic team and Inspector Slack's more conventional investigation. The tiny golden fleck was easily mistaken for dust or a stray fiber, yet Miss Marple's extensive knowledge of local flora immediately identified it as pollen from winter jasmine, a plant that bloomed at this time of year in only one location on the entire estate, a small secluded grotto nestled behind the old stables, rarely visited, and certainly not a place the meticulous Mrs. Whitmore would have frequented during her normal duties. The significance of this discovery resonated through Miss Marple's methodical mind, like a bell tolling the truth. If Mrs. Whitmore had simply gone to the pantry to fetch supplies for the afternoon's festivities, as everyone assumed, how could she have acquired pollen from a winter jasmine bloom that grew only in that particular, out-of-the-way location? The pantry floor showed no trace of such outdoor debris, and the rest of her clothing bore no evidence of any excursion beyond her participation in the day's events. This single speck of pollen suggested that Mrs. Whitmore had been somewhere else entirely just before her death, somewhere secret and secluded, implying a clandestine meeting that had somehow led to her violent end in the manor's interior. The implications transformed Miss Marple's understanding of the entire sequence of events. Rather than a spontaneous act of desperation by Julian Pemberton, cornered and exposed by the housekeeper's knowledge of his financial irregularities, the pollen suggested a prearranged encounter, a deliberate meeting that had escalated into violence. The lingering trace of violet perfume that Miss Marple had detected in the servants' corridor now took on new significance, potentially connecting the mysterious rendezvous in the grotto with the person who had ultimately struck down Mrs. Whitmore in the pantry. The careful positioning of the brass candlestick, the overturned chair, and the limited nature of the struggle all supported this theory of a planned confrontation rather than a chance encounter gone wrong. Miss Marple's attention was particularly drawn to young Penelope Davies, whose distress throughout the afternoon had seemed disproportionate to her claimed casual acquaintance with the deceased housekeeper. The girl's nervous behavior, her frequent anxious glances toward Julian Pemberton, and most tellingly, the faint scent of violet perfume that clung to her handkerchief, created a pattern that Miss Marple's experienced eye found increasingly compelling. During a brief, seemingly casual conversation, Miss Marple had noticed that Penelope was left-handed, a detail that might prove significant when examined alongside other evidence from the crime scene. The girl's obvious emotional connection to both Julian and Mrs. Whitmore suggested relationships and secrets that the official investigation had failed to explore adequately. Further examination of the pantry revealed additional subtle clues that supported Miss Marple's growing theory about the true sequence of events. A small piece of fine blue silk fabric caught on a wooden shelf spoke of expensive clothing and social position, while the scattered contents of Mrs. Whitmore's notebook suggested that the housekeeper had been wrestling with knowledge that placed her conscience in direct conflict with her loyalty to the Pemberton family. The notation about needing to set something right before it became too late for everyone concerned painted a picture of a woman who had discovered something that demanded action, regardless of the personal cost or potential consequences for those she had long protected. As the evening shadows deepened and Inspector Slack prepared to formalize his arrest of Julian Pemberton, Miss Marple found herself in possession of evidence that pointed in an entirely different direction. The winter jasmine pollen, combined with the violet perfume, the fabric evidence, and her observations of human behavior throughout the crisis suggested that Mrs. Whitmore had indeed seen too much, but not in the simple way that the official investigation assumed. The housekeeper had been drawn into a web of secrets and relationships that had ultimately cost her life, and the real killer remained free, protected by assumptions and misdirection that had fooled even the competent Inspector Slack. The challenge now lay in unraveling the true connections between the various players in this deadly drama before an innocent man paid the price for someone else's desperate actions. The drawing room at Thornfield Manor had transformed into an impromptu theater of human drama as evening settled with the soft authority of a butler drawing curtains, while Inspector Slack arranged his papers with the satisfied confidence of a man who believed motive, means, and opportunity had obligingly aligned themselves into a neat package suitable for immediate arrest. Miss Marple, her knitting shawl draped about her thin shoulders, moved with unhurried kindness among the remaining servants and guests, accepting cups of lukewarm tea, offering tactful silences, and storing every glance, tremor, and careless phrase with the methodical precision that another woman might reserve for preserving jam against the uncertainties of winter, for her long experience had taught her that truth often lay somewhere delicate and thoroughly human rather than bluntly obvious like brass candlesticks. Her patient conversations with the household staff had begun to yield fascinating insights that cast the afternoon's tragedy in an entirely different light than Inspector Slack's straightforward theory would accommodate. Young Elsie, steadied by the comfort of useful tasks and grateful for Miss Marple's gentle attention, revealed in hesitant bursts that Mrs. Whitmore had indeed made a mysterious telephone call the previous evening, but not to threaten or blackmail anyone as the inspector assumed. Instead, the housekeeper had contacted Mr. Penhaligon's chambers directly, speaking in the firm, hushed voice that could keep a household functioning smoothly through any crisis, using troublesome words like documents, your professional duty, and before anyone else is ruined, phrases that sounded far more like conscience than criminal intent to Miss Marple's experienced ear. The discovery of additional physical evidence further complicated the emerging picture of Mrs. Whitmore's final hours. Old Mr. Beach, the head gardener whose age had freed him from the burden of diplomatic discretion, confirmed that the winter jasmine bed near the secluded grotto had been severely trampled 2 mornings prior, with a decorative stone rabbit overturned and clear evidence of some sort of struggle or urgent activity. More significantly, he had observed a figure wearing a bright blue scarf running hastily around the stable corner that same morning, moving too quickly for positive identification, but leaving behind a small kid glove that he had subsequently mislaid while fetching garden twine, the sort of innocent accident that often proved crucial in retrospective investigations. Miss Marple's gentle interrogation of young Penelope Davies yielded the most significant breakthrough in understanding the true sequence of events. The girl, her composure finally cracking under the accumulated weight of guilt and terror, confessed through desperate whispers that Mrs. Whitmore had indeed arranged to meet her at the grotto that afternoon, ostensibly to discuss her clandestine romance with Julian Pemberton and to warn her about certain family secrets that might affect their future together. The housekeeper, torn between loyalty to the Pemberton family and genuine concern for the young people whose lives hung in the balance, had discovered that Julian's financial difficulties extended far beyond simple gambling debts to include dangerous creditors who would not hesitate to threaten Lady Pemberton herself to secure payment. However, Penelope's account contained troubling inconsistencies that suggested she was concealing crucial details about the encounter's conclusion. While she admitted to meeting Mrs. Whitmore at the appointed time and place, her explanation of their subsequent movements remained frustratingly vague, particularly regarding how the housekeeper had acquired the winter jasmine pollen that Miss Marple had discovered on her apron. The girl's obvious distress seemed genuine enough, but her frequent nervous glances and the way she unconsciously favored her left wrist suggested physical discomfort that might prove significant when examined alongside other evidence from the crime scene. More disturbing revelations emerged from Miss Marple's seemingly casual conversation with Mr. Arthur Penhaligon, whose legal training had failed to prevent him from displaying obvious nervousness when the discussion turned to matters of wills and estate planning. His excessive perspiration and too eager explanations about routine legal documents became even more suspicious when Miss Marple mentioned winter jasmine in passing, causing his eyes to drop immediately to her empty hands as if expecting to see incriminating evidence. A subsequent examination of Mrs. Whitmore's personal effects revealed a torn fragment from what appeared to be a legal codicil bearing only the initials J.P., which the village would naturally interpret as referring to Julian Pemberton, while a more experienced eye might recognize the standard abbreviation for Justice of the Peace that Mr. Penhaligon habitually appended to his name on official correspondence. Even Mrs. Bantry, caught between her natural curiosity and uncharacteristic caution, eventually confided that her earlier reticence had stemmed from embarrassment rather than guilt. Her unauthorized exploration of the morning room to admire the family silver had revealed that the brass candlesticks were already mismatched well before the murder occurred, with one piece newly polished, while its companion remained dull with neglect. More significantly, she had observed the flutter of a bright blue scarf disappearing around the servants' corridor corner, accompanied by the lingering scent of violet perfume that reminded her of the sachets in her grandmother's drawers, old-fashioned and particular in its feminine appeal. As the evening shadows deepened and Inspector Slack prepared to formalize his arrest of Julian Pemberton at first light, Miss Marple found herself in possession of evidence that pointed toward a far more complex truth than the official investigation had uncovered. The pattern of clues, secret meetings, legal documents, and suspicious behavior among multiple individuals suggested that Mrs. Whitmore had indeed seen too much. But her knowledge had threatened more than simple family embarrassment or financial irregularity. The housekeeper's final telephone call and her urgent meeting in the grotto painted a picture of a woman desperately trying to prevent disaster rather than create it. Someone whose conscience had ultimately cost her life when others decided that permanent silence was preferable to temporary scandal. The real killer remained free, protected by assumptions and misdirection that had successfully focused attention on the most obvious suspect, while the true perpetrator continued to hide among the grieving household, confident that their desperate gamble had succeeded. The evening shadows had settled over Thornfield Manor with the weight of accumulated secrets, while Inspector Slack arranged his papers with the satisfied confidence of a man who believed circumstantial evidence had obligingly aligned itself into a case suitable for immediate prosecution. Julian Pemberton remained confined to the morning room under watchful supervision, his pale defiance suggesting a young man caught in circumstances beyond his control rather than the cold calculation of a murderer, though Miss Marple observed that Inspector Slack's certainty had rendered him deaf to such subtle distinctions. The drawing room had transformed into an impromptu theatre of human drama, with Lady Pemberton maintaining her aristocratic composure through sheer force of breeding while the remaining household staff moved through their duties with the subdued efficiency that follows tragedy, their whispered conversations creating an undercurrent of unease that spoke volumes about the true state of village sentiment. Miss Marple's patient conversations throughout the evening had yielded a fascinating collection of details that cast the afternoon's events in an entirely different light than Inspector Slack's straightforward theory would accommodate. Her gentle inquiries among the servants had revealed that Mrs. Whitmore's mysterious telephone call to Mr. Penhaligon's chambers had concerned specific legal documents rather than general threats, with Elsie's fragmented recollections painting a picture of a woman desperately trying to prevent disaster rather than create it. The housekeeper's urgent words about needing to set things right before it became too late for everyone concerned suggested someone wrestling with knowledge that placed conscience in direct conflict with loyalty, a moral struggle that had ultimately cost her life when others decided that permanent silence was preferable to temporary scandal. The discovery of additional physical evidence during Miss Marple's seemingly casual exploration of the crime scene provided compelling support for her growing conviction that the official investigation had focused entirely in the wrong direction. A careful examination of the path between the secluded grotto and the manor's servants' entrance revealed several minute drops of blood, so small as to be nearly invisible but unmistakably fresh, creating a trail that led not from the pantry outward, as one might expect, but rather from the direction of the winter jasmine toward the house itself. This suggested that Mrs. Whitmore had been fatally injured during her clandestine meeting, and had somehow managed to make her way back toward safety before succumbing to her wounds, a sequence of events that fundamentally contradicted Inspector Slack's theory about spontaneous violence in the pantry. More significantly, Miss Marple's keen eye had detected a small silver button of distinctly feminine design lying half-buried beneath the winter jasmine roots, where it might have been torn loose during a violent struggle. The button's elegant craftsmanship and expensive materials spoke of someone with considerable social standing and traditional tastes, while its particular style indicated a woman who valued quality over fashionable innovation. When combined with the lingering traces of violet perfume that Miss Marple had detected in the servants' corridor, these clues began to paint a portrait of Mrs. Whitmore's killer that bore little resemblance to Julian Pemberton's masculine presence and expensive continental cologne. The evening's most revealing moment came when Mr. Arthur Penhaligon arrived in response to Lady Pemberton's urgent summons, his obvious nervousness and excessive perspiration creating a stark contrast to his usual professional composure. His explanation for Mrs. Whitmore's telephone call, claiming it concerned routine trust documents, rang hollow when measured against Elsie's account of urgent words about professional duty and preventing ruin. Miss Marple's seemingly innocent mention of winter jasmine caused his eyes to drop immediately to her hands as if expecting to see incriminating evidence, while his too eager protestations about the impossibility of connecting legal initials to his justice of the peace designation suggested a man desperately attempting to deflect suspicion from dangerous territory. The crisis that transformed the evening from tense waiting into active drama began with young Penelope Davies, whose emotional fragility had been evident throughout the day's questioning. Her confession, delivered through desperate whispers to Miss Marple's sympathetic ear, revealed that Mrs. Whitmore had indeed arranged their meeting at the grotto to discuss her romance with Julian and to warn her about family secrets that might affect their future together. However, Penelope's account contained troubling inconsistencies, particularly regarding how their encounter had concluded and how Mrs. Whitmore had acquired the winter jasmine pollen that Miss Marple had discovered on her apron. The girl's obvious distress seemed genuine, but her frequent nervous glances and the way she unconsciously favored her left wrist suggested physical discomfort that might prove significant when examined alongside the defensive wounds that Dr. Haydock had discovered on the housekeeper's body. As the evening progressed and Inspector Slack prepared to formalize his arrest at dawn, Miss Marple found herself in possession of evidence that pointed toward a crime of calculation rather than passion, one that struck at the very heart of the village's social structure. The pattern of clues suggested someone with intimate knowledge of both the manor's layout and Mrs. Whitmore's habits. Someone who could arrange a clandestine meeting without arousing suspicion and who possessed access to the morning room where the brass candlestick had been stored. The violet perfume, the expensive button, the defensive wounds and the trail of blood all indicated a perpetrator who was both desperate enough to commit murder and sophisticated enough to attempt framing an innocent man for the crime. The telephone's sudden jangling into the room's strained atmosphere brought news that confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicions about the true nature of Mrs. Whitmore's dangerous knowledge. Mr. Penhaligon's chambers had been broken into during the evening hours, with the safe standing open and files concerning Thornfield Manor's legal affairs mysteriously vanished. Inspector Slack's immediate assumption that Julian had somehow arranged this destruction of evidence from his confinement struck Miss Marple as yet another example of the inspector's unfortunate tendency to force facts into preconceived theories rather than allowing evidence to guide his conclusions. The housekeeper, who had seen too much, had indeed discovered something worth killing for, and now someone was desperately attempting to erase all traces of that deadly knowledge before it could threaten their carefully constructed facade of respectability. The burglary at Mr. Penhaligon's chambers had transformed the evening from tense anticipation into active crisis, while Inspector Slack's immediate assumption that Julian Pemberton had somehow orchestrated this destruction of evidence from his supervised confinement revealed the inspector's dangerous tendency to force inconvenient facts into preconceived theories rather than allowing evidence to guide his investigation toward uncomfortable truths. The timing of the break-in, occurring precisely when Julian remained under constant watch in the morning room, should have suggested to any competent investigator that the real perpetrator continued to move freely among them, desperately attempting to erase traces of the deadly knowledge that had cost Mrs. Whitmore her life and now threatened to expose secrets worth killing to protect. Miss Marple's patient observation throughout the crisis had revealed patterns of behavior that spoke volumes about guilt, innocence, and the complex motivations that drove seemingly respectable people to desperate acts of violence when their carefully constructed worlds faced exposure. Her gentle manner and apparent harmlessness had allowed her to conduct her own investigation without arousing official suspicion, while her decades of experience with human nature enabled her to detect the subtle signs of deception that others missed entirely. The evening's revelations had painted a picture of Mrs. Whitmore as a woman caught between conscience and loyalty, someone who had discovered information that demanded action regardless of personal cost or potential consequences for those she had served faithfully for 30 years. As Inspector Slack busied himself with securing the manor against what he termed further criminal activity by Julian's associates, Miss Marple seized the opportunity to conduct her own form of investigation, one that relied not on dramatic accusations or physical evidence, but on the careful observation of human nature under psychological pressure. She had learned long ago that moments of crisis stripped away the careful veneer of social propriety, revealing the true character of individuals when they believed themselves either safe from suspicion or cornered by circumstances beyond their control. The art of detection, she reflected, lay not in brilliant deductions, but in understanding how guilt and innocence manifested themselves in the smallest gestures and most carefully controlled reactions. Gathering the remaining household members in the drawing room under the pretext of offering comfort and discussing arrangements for the following day, Miss Marple positioned herself strategically near the fireplace, where the dancing flames would illuminate every subtle change of expression. Lady Pemberton maintained her aristocratic composure with admirable determination, though Miss Marple's experienced eye detected the subtle signs of strain that even excellent breeding could not entirely conceal. Mr. Penhaligon, having returned from examining the damage to his chambers, appeared more flustered than his professional dignity would normally permit, while young Penelope Davies remained pale and anxious, her distress seeming to encompass far more than simple shock at the day's tragic events. Miss Marple began her psychological test with seemingly innocent observations about winter jasmine, the delicate yellow flowers that had provided such crucial evidence in her understanding of the crime's true sequence. "Such a hopeful plant," she murmured, apparently to no one in particular, while her keen eyes catalogued every reaction. "Coming into bloom when all else seems dreary and dead. One notices it more for that reason, I think. The scent is so distinctive, so memorable once one encounters it in unexpected places." The seemingly casual comment produced fascinating results. Julian's puzzled indifference, Penelope's nervous fidgeting, and, most significantly, Lady Pemberton's almost imperceptible pause as she reached for her teacup, the delicate china betraying her inattention with the faintest tremor. The conversation then turned, with Miss Marple's characteristic gentle persistence, to matters of household management and the challenges facing those responsible for maintaining large estates in increasingly difficult times. Her seemingly innocent questions about trust funds, legal documents, and the burdens of financial responsibility created an atmosphere of mounting tension as various individuals realized that their carefully guarded secrets might not be as secure as they had believed. Mr. Penhaligon's excessive perspiration and too eager explanations about routine legal matters became increasingly suspicious when combined with his obvious nervousness about the missing files from his chambers, particularly those concerning Thornfield Manor's financial affairs. Most revealing was the reaction to Miss Marple's gentle observation about Mrs. Whitmore's unwavering loyalty and her fierce determination to protect the Pemberton family's reputation at any cost. "She would have gone to extraordinary lengths," Miss Marple noted thoughtfully, "to prevent any blemish upon the family name, even if it meant confronting uncomfortable truths about matters that others preferred to keep buried." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Miss Marple watched with professional interest as Lady Pemberton's carefully maintained composure showed its first genuine crack, a subtle tightening around her eyes that spoke of secrets and the desperate measures people would take to protect them. The evening's most significant breakthrough came when Miss Marple, employing the subtle psychological pressure that had served her well in previous investigations, made casual reference to the violet perfume that had lingered in the servants' corridor, where no guest should have ventured. The mention of this distinctive fragrance, combined with her observations about expensive silver buttons and the particular challenges facing widowed ladies in maintaining their social positions, created a web of implications that began to tighten around the true perpetrator. The pattern of evidence was becoming clear to Miss Marple's methodical mind. Someone with intimate knowledge of both the manor's layout and Mrs. Whitmore's routines, someone who could arrange clandestine meetings without arousing suspicion, and someone whose financial desperation had driven them to increasingly dangerous measures when faced with exposure. As the evening progressed toward what promised to be a dramatic conclusion, Miss Marple found herself in possession of evidence that pointed toward a crime of calculation rather than passion, one that struck at the very heart of the village's social structure and revealed the lengths to which seemingly respectable people would go to protect their carefully constructed facades. The housekeeper who had seen too much had indeed discovered something worth killing for, and now the challenge lay in exposing the truth without allowing an innocent man to pay the price for someone else's desperate gamble. The psychological testing had revealed the guilty party's vulnerability, and Miss Marple prepared to apply the gentle but relentless pressure that would finally force the truth into the light where it belonged. The drawing-room had transformed into an arena of unspoken accusations and barely contained tension, while Inspector Slack arranged his papers with the grim satisfaction of a man preparing to conclude a case that had tested his patience and professional competence throughout the long afternoon and evening. Julian Pemberton remained under careful supervision in the morning room, his pale defiance suggesting a young man caught in circumstances beyond his control rather than the cold calculation of a murderer, though Miss Marple observed that Inspector Slack's certainty had rendered him deaf to such subtle distinctions between guilt and mere unfortunate timing. The remaining household members had gathered with the subdued efficiency that follows tragedy, their whispered conversations and nervous glances, creating an atmosphere of mounting dread as everyone present understood that the final act of this deadly drama was about to unfold with all its inevitable consequences. Miss Marple rose from her position near the fireplace with the deceptive frailty that had served her well throughout decades of patient observation, her knitting abandoned but her keen mind sharper than any detective's magnifying glass as she prepared to conduct her own form of investigation. She had learned long ago that moments of crisis stripped away the careful veneer of social propriety, revealing the true nature of individuals when they believe themselves either safe from suspicion or cornered by circumstances beyond their control. And the evening's revelations had provided her with all the evidence necessary to expose the truth that lay hidden beneath layers of deception and misdirection. Her gentle manner and apparent harmlessness had allowed her to gather crucial information without arousing official suspicion, while her understanding of human psychology enabled her to recognize the patterns of behavior that spoke more eloquently than any physical evidence about guilt, innocence, and the desperate measures people would take to protect their carefully constructed worlds from exposure. Under the pretext of offering final comfort before Inspector Slack's anticipated arrest, Miss Marple requested permission to conduct what she termed a small experiment in human nature that would either confirm the inspector's conclusions or reveal uncomfortable truths that had been overlooked in the rush toward convenient solutions. She produced from her knitting bag a small sealed envelope and a delicate silver button, placing both items on the tea tray with the same careful attention she might give to arranging flowers, though her purpose was far more serious than mere decoration. The envelope, she explained in her mild conversational tone, contained what she believed to be the true motive for Mrs. Whitmore's murder, while the button represented physical evidence that had been discovered near the Winter Jasmine Grotto, where the housekeeper had met her death during what was supposed to be a secret rendezvous with someone she trusted completely. The psychological tests that followed demonstrated Miss Marple's masterful understanding of human nature under pressure, as she observed each person's reaction to her seemingly innocent observations about winter jasmine pollen, violet perfume, and the particular challenges facing those who struggled to maintain appearances when their financial resources had been secretly compromised by years of careful embezzlement from their own estate funds. Lady Pemberton's aristocratic composure, maintained through decades of social obligation and personal tragedy, began to show subtle but unmistakable signs of strain as Miss Marple's gentle questioning touched upon the desperate measures that respectable people might take when faced with exposure of financial irregularities that would destroy not only their own reputations, but the futures of family members who depended upon them for security and social position. The breakthrough came when Miss Marple revealed her understanding of the true sequence of events that had led to Mrs. Whitmore's death, beginning with the housekeeper's discovery that Lady Pemberton had been systematically appropriating funds from various estate accounts to maintain Thornfield Manor's operations while concealing the true extent of their financial difficulties from both Julian and the village community. Mrs. Whitmore's telephone call to Mr. Penhaligon's chambers had not been a threat of blackmail, but rather the desperate plea of a loyal servant who had discovered her employer's deception and was attempting to find a legal solution that would prevent scandal while ensuring that proper restitution could be made before the situation became irreversibly damaging to everyone involved in the household's complex web of relationships and dependencies. Lady Pemberton's confession, extracted through Miss Marple's relentless but gentle psychological pressure, revealed the tragic circumstances that had driven a respectable widow to commit murder when faced with exposure of her financial manipulations. The confrontation at the grotto had begun as Mrs. Whitmore's attempt to persuade her employer to confess voluntarily to the authorities and make arrangements for repayment. But Lady Pemberton's desperation had transformed reasonable discussion into violence when she realized that the housekeeper's unwavering sense of duty would not permit compromise or delay in addressing what she considered a fundamental betrayal of trust. The brass candlestick, taken from the morning room where Lady Pemberton had unrestricted access, had been used first to strike down Mrs. Whitmore at the grotto and then transported to the pantry where the body was positioned to suggest spontaneous violence rather than premeditated murder designed to protect years of carefully concealed financial deception. As Inspector Slack absorbed the implications of this revelation and the overwhelming evidence that Miss Marple had assembled throughout her patient investigation, the true tragedy of the situation became apparent to everyone present in the suddenly silent drawing room. Mrs. Whitmore had indeed seen too much, but her dangerous knowledge had concerned financial irregularities rather than personal scandals, and her death had resulted from loyalty and moral obligation rather than greed or malicious intent to cause harm to those she had served faithfully for 30 years. The housekeeper's unwavering commitment to protecting the Pemberton family's reputation had ultimately placed her in mortal danger when that same dedication conflicted with her equally strong sense of ethical responsibility, creating an impossible situation where violence had seemed the only solution to preserve everything that Lady Pemberton had worked desperately to maintain in the face of mounting financial pressures and social expectations that demanded perfection regardless of personal cost. The drawing room fell into the profound silence that follows the exposure of truth, while Lady Pemberton's aristocratic composure finally crumbled under the weight of Miss Marple's gentle but inexorable revelation of facts that could no longer be denied or deflected through careful social maneuvering. Inspector Slack, his methodical certainty about Julian's guilt replaced by the uncomfortable realization that his investigation had focused entirely in the wrong direction, struggled to reconcile his straightforward theories with the complex web of financial deception and misguided loyalty that Miss Marple had patiently unraveled throughout the evening's careful psychological examination. The transformation from confident prosecutor to bewildered investigator was painful to witness, though Miss Marple felt no satisfaction in demonstrating the limitations of conventional detection when applied to crimes that sprang from the deepest wells of human desperation and social pressure. Miss Marple's patient explanation revealed how each piece of evidence had pointed toward Lady Pemberton from the beginning if one had possessed the wisdom to look beyond the obvious. The winter jasmine pollen on Mrs. Whitmore's apron indicated their fatal meeting at the secluded grotto, while the trail of blood leading back toward the manor told the tragic story of a wounded woman attempting to reach safety before succumbing to her injuries. The expensive silver button torn loose during their struggle spoke of quality clothing and traditional tastes, while the lingering violet perfume in the servants' corridor was the old-fashioned fragrance favored by ladies of Lady Pemberton's generation and social standing. Most significantly, Mrs. Whitmore's telephone call to Mr. Penhaligon had concerned not blackmail or threats, but the desperate plea of a loyal servant seeking legal guidance to address financial irregularities she had discovered in the estate's accounts. Lady Pemberton's confession, delivered in the measured tones that a lifetime of breeding had made automatic even in moments of complete personal collapse, revealed the tragic sequence of events that had begun years earlier with her husband's death and the subsequent discovery that Thornfield Manor's finances were far more precarious than anyone had suspected. Her systematic appropriation of funds from various estate accounts had initially been intended as temporary measures to maintain the household's operations while she sought more permanent solutions to their financial difficulties. However, the mounting pressures of social expectations and her determination to preserve Julian's inheritance had gradually transformed prudent management into outright embezzlement that required increasingly desperate measures to conceal from both family members and village authorities. The confrontation with Mrs. Whitmore at the Winter Jasmine Grotto had begun as the housekeeper's well-intentioned attempt to offer assistance in finding legal solutions to the financial irregularities she had discovered during her meticulous review of household accounts. Mrs. Whitmore's unwavering loyalty to the Pemberton family had been matched only by her equally strong sense of moral obligation, creating an impossible conflict between her desire to protect her employers and her conviction that proper restitution must be made before the situation caused irreversible damage to everyone involved. When Lady Pemberton realized that Mrs. Whitmore's determination to set things right would inevitably lead to exposure of the financial manipulations that had kept Thornfield Manor functioning, panic had transformed reasonable discussion into violence. The brass candlestick, seized in a moment of desperate terror, had been used to silence the one person whose knowledge threatened to destroy everything that Lady Pemberton had worked frantically to preserve through years of careful deception. Julian Pemberton, released from his confinement in the morning room, appeared more bewildered than relieved as he attempted to comprehend the extent of his aunt's financial deceptions and the desperate measures she had taken to conceal them from his knowledge. The weight of suspicion had been lifted, but in its place lay the devastating knowledge of his aunt's actions and the true cost of the family secrets that had haunted Thornfield Manor. Young Penelope Davies, her earlier nervousness now explained as concern for Julian rather than guilty knowledge of the crime, wept openly for the woman whose loyalty had ultimately cost her everything in a misguided attempt to protect the family she had served with such unwavering dedication. Mr. Penhaligon's obvious relief at learning that his missing files concerned estate embezzlement rather than his own professional misconduct was tempered by his recognition that he would now face the unpleasant task of unraveling years of financial irregularities. The break-in at his chambers, he now realized, had been Lady Pemberton's desperate final attempt to destroy evidence of her financial manipulations before Mrs. Whitmore's death could lead investigators to examine the estate's books with the thoroughness that would inevitably expose her systematic embezzlement. The news of Lady Pemberton's arrest and the true circumstances of Mrs. Whitmore's murder spread through the village like wildfire, transforming the initial shock into a complex mixture of disbelief, morbid fascination, and a peculiar sense of vindication for those who had always suspected that beneath the veneer of respectability, dark currents flowed. The annual summer fete, meant to be a celebration of community and tradition, would forever be etched in the collective memory as the day Thornfield Manor's carefully guarded secrets were brutally exposed. The villagers, who had always prided themselves on their intimate knowledge of one another, were left to ponder the unsettling truth that their most respected matriarch had been capable of such desperate acts. In the days that followed, Thornfield Manor became a somber place, its once bustling corridors now hushed, its grand rooms filled with the ghosts of past gaiety and recent tragedy. Young Elsie, though still traumatized by her discovery, found a new sense of purpose in her testimony, her simple honesty providing a stark contrast to the layers of deceit that had been uncovered. The household staff moved like careful ghosts through rooms that had become repositories of a history they would not speak of aloud, while old Mr. Beach tended the winter jasmine with particular care, as if nurturing something sacred from the tragedy that had unfolded beneath its delicate blooms. Miss Marple remained at Thornfield Manor for a few more days, offering quiet support to Julian and Penelope, whose relationship, though momentarily overshadowed by the day's horrors, now seemed to rest on a foundation of shared understanding rather than romantic illusion. She observed the subtle shifts in the village's social dynamics, noting how certain friendships cooled while others unexpectedly deepened in the aftermath of the scandal. As she prepared for her departure, standing at the window overlooking the lawn where the fete had taken place, she reflected on Mrs. Whitmore, the quiet, observant housekeeper whose unwavering sense of duty had ultimately cost her life. The housekeeper who had seen too much had indeed discovered secrets worth killing for, but those secrets had concerned financial desperation rather than personal scandal, and her death had resulted from misguided loyalty rather than criminal greed. Human nature, Miss Marple mused, remained much the same everywhere, with only the settings changing like patterns in a tapestry. The desire to maintain appearances, the fear of exposure, and the desperate scramble to protect a carefully constructed world were threads that ran through the fabric of humanity, sometimes unraveling tragically into violence. With her sensible traveling bag packed and a jar of Lady Pemberton's marmalade tucked away as a melancholy remembrance, Miss Marple stepped out into the crisp air, leaving the village to slowly heal as she carried with her another intricate, chilling example of the cozy yet deadly realities of human nature. The aftermath of Lady Pemberton's confession settled over Thornfield Manor like morning mist, carrying with it the peculiar silence that follows public calamity, where every whispered conversation and carefully drawn curtain seemed to acknowledge the disgrace that had fallen upon one of the village's most respected names. Miss Marple, her sensible traveling bag packed and her knitting carefully rolled into its familiar bundle, observed from the morning-room window how tragedy had transformed the landscape she had come to know so intimately during her brief but eventful visit. The croquet pitch, where guests had laughed and competed mere days before, now lay abandoned, its carefully maintained lawn bearing ghostly impressions of hastily abandoned equipment, while the rose garden seemed to droop with more than seasonal decline, as if the very flowers understood that their mistress would no longer tend them with the devoted attention that had made Thornfield's gardens the envy of neighboring estates. The village's complex response. The village's reaction to the shocking revelations revealed fascinating insights into the complex social dynamics that governed their seemingly harmonious community. Mrs. Bantry, initially a vocal proponent of Julian's guilt, found herself in the awkward position of retracting numerous pronouncements, a task she performed with uncharacteristic humility while painting Lady Pemberton as a victim of impossible circumstances. Those who had always resented inherited privilege found grim satisfaction in witnessing the downfall of someone they perceived as having lived unearned advantages, while others, particularly the older generation who remembered Lady Pemberton's charitable works, struggled to reconcile their memories of kindness with the harsh reality of calculated murder. The transformation from beloved benefactress to desperate criminal struck at the very heart of their assumptions about social order and moral certainty. Julian Pemberton, though cleared of all suspicion, faced the daunting task of reconstructing both his family's finances and his understanding of the woman who had raised him. The estate's books revealed years of systematic embezzlement that had begun as temporary expedients but had gradually evolved into elaborate deceptions designed to maintain appearances while concealing financial ruin. With characteristic determination, Julian instructed Mr. Penhaligon to arrange the sale of the far field, directing proceeds toward debt discharge and securing modest provisions for the remaining staff who might otherwise face dismissal. These decisions earned him a respect more durable than admiration for charm, marking his transformation from carefree nephew to responsible estate manager. Young Penelope Davies emerged from the ordeal with deeper understanding of adult complexities, her romance with Julian now resting on the solid foundation of shared adversity rather than romantic illusion. Her decision to take teaching positions at the village school 3 afternoons weekly, instructing children in proper breathing and clear enunciation, reflected her newfound appreciation for useful discipline in all matters of life. Miss Marple noted with approval how genuine affection often flourished more readily in tragedy's aftermath than in purely social courtship's artificial atmosphere. Mr. Arthur Penhaligon, whose chambers had been burglarized in Lady Pemberton's desperate final attempt to destroy evidence, faced the unpleasant task of unraveling years of complex financial manipulations while maintaining professional discretion. His obvious relief at learning the missing files concerned estate embezzlement rather than his own professional misconduct was tempered by recognition that legal proceedings would inevitably expose details Lady Pemberton had worked frantically to conceal. Inspector Slack, his initial confidence replaced by grudging admiration for Miss Marple's patient investigation, admitted his conventional approach had been inadequate for crimes springing from complex psychological pressures of maintaining social appearances. Thornfield Manor itself stood like a silent sentinel, its grand rooms echoing with ghosts of past gaiety and recent tragedy. The meticulous order Mrs. Whitmore had maintained for decades began to fray as remaining staff. Their numbers reduced and morale shaken, struggled to continue. The carefully tended gardens, once testament to Lady Pemberton's pride, seemed to droop under scandal's weight, blooming flowers, creating poignant contrast to the family's withered hopes. The estate's future remained uncertain, its fate intricately tied to legal proceedings and eventual asset disposition, though Julian's responsible approach suggested hope for eventual recovery, built on honesty rather than inherited pretense. In the housekeeper's small room, neatly closed and dusted by Elsie with reverence usually reserved for altar rails, a black notebook lay upon the table where Miss Marple had left it. Its final page bore not accusations, but simple tasks. Apples to be stewed, silver to be wrapped, a seam mended in green damask curtains, and a last line reading simply, "Speak plainly and without fear." Elsie traced these words with trembling fingertips, promising in whispers no one was meant to hear that she would honor such courage if ever such moments came, finding comfort that duty might continue through those remaining, as duties often do when carried by faithful hands. As Miss Marple prepared for departure, she reflected on the tragic irony that Mrs. Whitmore's death had resulted not from malicious intent, but from collision between equally strong moral imperatives, family loyalty and ethical dedication. The housekeeper, who had seen too much, had indeed discovered secrets worth killing for, but those secrets concerned financial desperation rather than personal scandal. Her murder, the desperate act of a woman who saw no alternative to preserve everything she'd worked frantically to maintain through increasingly elaborate deceptions. Standing at the drawing-room window one final time, gazing toward the lawn where the fête had taken place, Miss Marple noted how the winter jasmine continued blooming despite its role in the tragic drama. Its delicate yellow blossoms a reminder that hidden beauty and dangerous secrets could coexist in even the most tranquil settings. Human nature, she mused, remained consistent everywhere, with only settings changing like patterns in an endlessly recurring tapestry. The desire to maintain appearances, fear of exposure, and desperate scrambles to protect carefully constructed worlds were threads running through humanity's fabric, sometimes unraveling tragically into violence. With her jar of Lady Pemberton's marmalade tucked away as melancholy remembrance, Miss Marple stepped into crisp morning air, leaving the village to heal slowly while carrying another intricate example of human nature's cozy yet deadly realities. Grateful for a world where trifles disclosed tragedies, and tragedies restored the value of trifles in the endless, instructive drama of ordinary life. The morning mist had lifted from Thornfield Manor's grounds as Miss Marple made her final preparations for departure, her sensible traveling case packed with the methodical efficiency that characterized all her endeavors, though she found herself lingering at the morning-room window where the events of recent days had unfolded with such tragic inevitability. The village beyond appeared deceptively peaceful in the golden autumn light, its familiar cottages and winding lanes giving no indication of the upheaval that had shattered the community's carefully maintained assumptions about respectability, loyalty, and the dangerous secrets that could flourish beneath the most civilized surfaces. Her brief sojourn at Thornfield had provided yet another instructive example of human nature's capacity for both devotion and destruction, reminding her once again that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared least capable of violence, while the most obvious suspects frequently proved to be elaborate misdirections designed to protect the truly guilty parties. Lady Pemberton's trial had concluded with a verdict that surprised no one who understood the complex circumstances that had driven a respected widow to commit murder when faced with exposure of financial irregularities that would have destroyed not only her own reputation, but the futures of family members who depended upon her for security and social position. The judge's sentencing reflected both the gravity of her crime and recognition of the desperate circumstances that had precipitated such tragic actions, while the village's response demonstrated the complex mixture of condemnation and sympathy that greeted those who fell from positions of respected authority. Julian Pemberton's transformation from carefree nephew to responsible estate manager had progressed with remarkable steadiness, his engagement to Penelope Davies representing a foundation built on shared adversity rather than romantic illusion, suggesting a partnership likely to endure the inevitable challenges that life would present to their reconstructed household. The transformation in village social dynamics revealed fascinating insights into how communities adapt to revelations that challenge their fundamental assumptions about character and respectability. Mrs. Bantry, having learned painful lessons about the dangers of premature judgment, had developed a newfound appreciation for the complexities that lay beneath surface appearances, while others who had initially reveled in witnessing the downfall of inherited privilege gradually came to understand the tragic human costs of such spectacular collapses. Young Elsie, promoted to head housekeeper through necessity rather than ambition, had discovered within herself reserves of competence and authority that surprised everyone as she worked to maintain the standards that Mrs. Whitmore had established through 30 years of devoted service. The black notebook left on the deceased housekeeper's table had become an unofficial guide to household management, its practical wisdom and moral clarity providing continuing instruction for those who remained to carry on the essential work of daily life. As the hired car arrived to transport Miss Marple to the railway station, she took one final look at Thornfield Manor's elegant Georgian facade, noting how tragedy had not diminished its architectural beauty, but had certainly altered the atmosphere that surrounded it like an invisible but permanent alteration in the very air itself. The winter jasmine near the secluded grotto continued to bloom with particular abundance, as if nature itself sought to honor the memory of someone whose loyalty had ultimately cost her everything in a misguided attempt to protect those she had served with such unwavering dedication. Her investigation had revealed once again that the most dangerous secrets were often those that grew from the best intentions, while the most tragic crimes frequently resulted from collision between equally strong moral imperatives that admitted no compromise or peaceful resolution. During the journey back to her own village, Miss Marple reflected on the universal patterns of human behavior that had made Mrs. Whitmore's murder both shocking and entirely predictable to those who understood the pressures that could transform respectable people into desperate criminals when their carefully constructed worlds faced exposure. The gentle rhythm of the train wheels provided a soothing counterpoint to her thoughts as she gazed out at the passing English countryside, now bathed in the mellow light of late autumn afternoon. The familiar patterns of hedgerows, grazing sheep, and distant church spires offered a comforting constancy, a stark contrast to the turmoil she had recently left behind at Thornfield Manor, where a garden party had transformed into a crime scene and a trusted housekeeper had paid the ultimate price for her unwavering sense of duty. The memory of Lady Pemberton's confession still resonated, a chilling testament to the desperate lengths to which even the most outwardly respectable individuals would go to protect their carefully constructed facades. It was not a crime of malice, Miss Marple reflected, but one born of fear and misguided duty, a tragic collision between a woman's desperate attempt to preserve her family's legacy and a loyal servant's unwavering moral compass. The tiny speck of winter jasmine pollen, the faint scent of violet perfume, the elegant silver button, each seemingly insignificant detail had woven itself into a tapestry of evidence that pointed unerringly toward the true perpetrator, reminding her that it was never the dramatic gesture, but rather the quiet, almost imperceptible deviations from normal behavior that revealed the truth to those patient enough to observe and wise enough to understand. As her train pulled into the familiar station of her own village, Miss Marple gathered her belongings with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had once again witnessed justice prevail, despite the complex circumstances that had initially obscured the truth from less patient investigators. The housekeeper, who had seen too much, had indeed discovered knowledge worth killing for, but that knowledge had concerned financial desperation rather than personal scandal, making her death a particularly poignant example of how loyalty and duty could become fatal vulnerabilities when confronted by panic and desperation. With her jar of Lady Pemberton's marmalade tucked carefully in her travelling case as a melancholy reminder, Miss Marple stepped onto the platform, carrying with her another intricate example of human nature's cozy yet deadly realities. Grateful for a world where small details disclosed great truths and where patience and observation could restore justice to even the most carefully concealed crimes.